Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study of Origins, the book of Genesis. I'm John Walker, and I'm sitting with Bruce Wadzik, the minister of the Princeton Church of Christ. Bruce, where are we in our study?
We're ready to begin chapters 10 and 11 and finish up the introductory material in the book of Genesis that places the story of Israel in the context of the entire world. You know, God wasn't just concerned about the Jews, he was concerned about all peoples. And we see that by how the Hebrew Bible starts out with a universalist concern on God's part. We, of course, have read about how God restored creation and how, after a catastrophic flood, because of man's sinfulness, that God had given them a new beginning. A new creation took place, and Noah and his family had a fresh start in this world. And God made a covenant with not only Noah, but all the earth and all the creatures for all generations, which would include us, that he was never, he promised, going to destroy the world again by a flood. And then he had certain expectations and certain things he allowed them to do that prior to that point, God had not directly permitted the eating of animals. So there were a number of things involved in this covenant with Noah. But of course, we discover this is, as God himself said, even though man continues to be consumed with evil from his youth, I'm still not going to destroy the world by water again. And so God now is looking for a new way to try to reach humankind. And we're going to discover the particular direction of this by the end of our discussion today in chapter 11. The question really that hovers over these opening chapters is whether men are going to fulfill God's purposes and rule over the creation, or whether sin is going to rule over them. And of course, the bad news thus far is that sin has ended up being the ruler. So let's pick up in chapter 10, beginning with verse 1.
This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Raphath, Jacharma. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittites, and the Radonites. From these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Sapta, Raama, and Saptaka. The sons of Raama: Sheba and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Egypt was the father of the Ludites, Anamites, Leabites, Naphtuhites, and Pathrusites, Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorites. Canaan was the father of Sidon, the firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arbidites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Later, the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zebaim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. Bruce, what is the point of all of these things in the genealogy?
Well, the big picture that I think that's trying to be presented here is when you number up the total number of individuals that are highlighted in the 10th chapter, it's oftentimes referred to as the table of nations, is that there are 70 nations in all, or tribes, clans, and territories that are referred to. And the Jews believed throughout their history that there were 70 major non-Israelite nations that God had given territory to, that lived in the part of the world in which Israel would have contact with them. It's not talking about what's happening in China, not talking about what's happening in India, not what's talking about what's happening in the Americas. It's only talking about those kind of nations that were in relative proximity to Israel, that Israel would have some trading or other interactions with over time. And there are approximately 70 of these. It starts off by talking about, these are the three sons of Noah. And Jephthah, it outlines the number of key individuals in his descendants that represent a variety of nations. It appears that Jephthah's descendants were mostly inhabitants of northern Mesopotamia and going over into Europe, and especially being the origin for the various sea peoples, the Greeks, Philistines, etc., that were seagoing people that began to inhabit the circle of the Mediterranean. Then when it talks about Shem's descendants appear to be more central Mesopotamia, coming through Canaan, going down into Egypt, North Africa, and those regions is where his descendants settled. And so it's giving us a general breakdown of what will be the nations of the future with whom Israel, the people of God, will have their own relationships with. But then it highlights one individual, a third descendant in line. Oftentimes, key individuals occur third in line in descendants. And this individual is the son of Cush, Nimrod. And he is remembered, evidently, even in the day in which the book was originally written. There was an expression among the people that one might be like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And this was one of the ancient people that was memorable because they were one of those men of renown or mighty warriors, which alludes back to what was said in chapter 6 about when the daughters of Ha-Adam married the angelic beings that had taken human form and had children called the Nephilim. They were also referred to as men of renown or mighty warriors. And so the spirit of the Nephilim continue in Nimrod. So we haven't gotten rid of the violence and those seeking renown for themselves by the flood. It also says that he was known for being the founder of a variety of cities. And we'll recognize a couple of them. And one reason why this is important is one of them is Nineveh. And of course, Nineveh ended up being the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And Assyria subjugated much of the Middle East and they were the people that conquered northern Israel about 720 BC and carried their inhabitants off into exile. But the Babylon eventually got free of Assyria, conquered Syria, and controlled most of the Middle East. And they're the ones that attacked Judah, destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and carried the people off into captivity about 586 BC. So these cities that were founded by Nimrod, some of them went on to be the centers of great empires later on in the history of the Middle East. Also, the Uruk, we think that may be referring to a city that the Gilgamesh epic refers to as the very first city that Gilgamesh built. Matter of fact, Nimrod sounds a whole lot like the character Gilgamesh, who was a great warrior and king, but we can't be for sure. Another interesting thing is the word Nimrod can be translated the one who rebels or the rebel. So, of course, the problem before the flood now is a problem after the flood. We have men of renown that are known for being rebels against God's purposes and against what God's intentions were for people. They sought to be kings and rule over other men, where God never envisioned men ruling over one another, but instead being rulers over a creation. So the story goes on, highlights, of course, Canaan, because that and the various groups there, what territory they covered, because that's going to be very important for the later history of the people of Israel. And I think one important thing is, oftentimes we think about something like this outlining the division among the various nations. We think in modern terms as if the Bible is delineating a division among the races. But this idea of racial differences defining people is a modern idea. It's not something that comes out of the ancient world. They didn't view people in racial terms. And so these divisions into nations and clans and tribes and territories had nothing to do with the modern idea of racial identity. And the ancient world, people's identity came more from the territory they lived in, and no one viewed a people living in a certain area as a racial group. And the New Testament affirms this view that the Old Testament has of peoples, that we all are people coming from the same ancestry, that we all are one people, because in chapter 17 of Acts, the Apostle Paul, speaking to folks in Athens, challenged their understanding about God in verses 26 and following.
From one man he made all nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own prophets have said, we are his offspring.
And so it's making a clear point that from the biblical perspective, we all have a common ancestry, and we are all related to one another through Adam and Noah and the other creations of God. And that the differences are that God has allowed different peoples at different times to inhabit certain territories, but it's God that's put limits on their boundaries and their time in history to be able to influence the world and the region of Mesopotamia that the focal point of the biblical narrative is on. So we want to remember today not to be so caught up in this ideas of racial identity. This is a misnomer. That's not what defines us. We are image bearers of God. Everyone deserves equal respect, for they are made in the image of God. That's the biblical understanding. It's not, yes, people divide into nations and groups, and sometimes they war against one another, etc., and treat each other inhumanely, which is what you would expect of sinners who rebel against God from their youth, and their minds are filled with evil. And I think even the whole way of trying to identify people by skin color is just an evil way to make some sort of superficial thing be a significant thing. It's not significant. The fact we're made in the image of God, that's what makes us significant and different from the animal kingdom. Well, let's pick up where we left off back in chapter 10 of Genesis.
Picking up at verse 21. Sons were also born in Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem: Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram: Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. The sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was the father of Almadad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzo, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha toward Sephar in the eastern hill country. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stones, and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower of the people, and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible to them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Bruce, where does Ha-Adam return in these verses?
Remember, we highlighted the fact that besides referring to the human race, using the generic term Adam for the human race, it also refers back in Genesis 1, verse 27, to the Ha-Adam, the Adam, which clearly alludes, as it shows in chapter 2 and following, to Adam and Eve, and then their immediate descendants, who are referred to later in chapter 6 as the daughters of Ha-Adam, that are involved with the angels and give birth to the Nephilim. But here, obscured in English, I can't think of any good English translation that brings this out. Verse 5 of chapter 11 says, "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower," and literally in Hebrew, the tower that the sons of Ha-Adam were building. So it's identifying these people through Noah as being descendants from the representative figure of Adam and Eve, that they are still those descendants of Ha-Adam, that are now, just like the daughters of Ha-Adam had gone astray before the flood, now the sons of Ha-Adam go astray by building an idolatrous city with a vast temple complex rising up into the sky. But going back a little bit further, we noticed it gave the descendants of the first two brothers. And then in this last section of chapter 10, it tells about the descendants of the third son, Shem. But as it goes through his descendants, you'll notice that it says he has two sons, verse 25, to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. Perhaps that's referring to the division that occurs because of the confusion of language in chapter 11. But then it goes on to say Jotham was his brother, and it goes on to tell about Jotham's descendants, but doesn't tell about Peleg's descendants. But he's saving that for chapter 11, because it's through Peleg that we get to, in a 10th generation, the key descendant that the biblical story is going to center on, and that is Abram. The region, it appears that Shem, in contrast to his other two brothers, settled in was, he settled in some parts of northern and southern Mesopotamia, but more to the east, where Jephthah settled in Mesopotamia, northern, more towards the west, and into Europe. And instead, the Shemites settled in what we would call Iraq, Iran region. And then specifically, I think it goes back in time in chapter 11 to deal with a key event that's important to the Israelites, because the Israelites have their origin with Abraham in these plains of Shinar, in a city called Ur of the Chaldeans. And in the end, the last remnants of the nation of Judah are conquered by the same peoples of this region and are exiled, brought all the way from Israel to live in Babylon. And of course, after they're conquered by the Persians, some of them are allowed to go back and resettle Israel. But you see how important Babylon and that region, Shinar, was, because they came from this region and they returned to this region in the story. If you will, the whole story is about how you began at one place and end back up there, even though God intended you to live in another place. And it was because of their rebellion and sin, the story of the human race up until this point. So this is an incident that's particularly of interest to the Jews that would have occurred in the building of the great city of Babylon. It says at that time the whole world had one language and a common speech. Now, this could mean one of two things. It could mean that shortly after leaving the ark, everybody spoke the same basic language. Or it could mean that although people had developed their own dialects living in their own areas, at some point in an attempt to unify them, they developed a common language that they could speak to one another in. And kind of like English is a universal language in the world today, and in the time of the first century of Jesus and Paul the Apostle, Greek was the common language used in that day. So we don't know which one it is, and it doesn't really matter, because God confused their ability to communicate, and that's what caused them to spread, as chapter 10 discusses, throughout the Middle East of the ancient world. But notice the key is there's a war of words between these descendants of Ha-Adam, who have a great deal of pride and egotism. And they're all about a brand new technology that they have developed, that of brick making. They say, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They use brick instead of stone. So it's telling that the readers, because in Israel, they built everything almost out of stone because it was so plentiful. And they used tar for mortar. That was not common at all in Israel. So this is a new technology. Think of it this way. They settled in the plains of Shinar. So we're talking about a plain. We're talking about they're a long distance away from mountains. The mountains would have the rock. So what do you have in the plains? Well, you have good, rich soil to grow on, and then you have a lot of clay. So they discovered that they could take some of the dirt, the clay, they could bake it, and they could make a very hard substance out of which they could build houses that would last for long periods of time, and out of which they made their cities, and of course, ultimately, these towers. These towers had some similarity to the pyramids in Egypt, but they were more directly step pyramids. They had steps that went up to the very top of them. They are referred to, and we find the remnants of a number of them even today in that part of the world, called ziggurats. Most of them, again, you can imagine, versus stone. The pyramids are still there. Stone, the stuff that was on the outside of the pyramids that at one time, but that's gone. But the stones are still there. But again, baked bricks are not going to last as long. And so you have mostly the rubble left over from a time when in ancient times they built these ziggurats. So again, it's going to be this word of man, come, let's do this great task together. And the first point of building the tower was that it might reach up into the heavens. In the ancient world, they didn't know what we know. They could see the sky above, and in the sky was the sun at times, and then at night was the moon and stars, and it appeared like it was on a disc rotating. So some of them thought that there was a kind of solid firmament up here that rotated around, and some even believed that the very highest mountains on the earth were like poles that held up this disc. So theoretically, if you could build something high enough, you could literally puncture this disc realm and get into the realm where God was, and where they believed the ancient deities they worshipped were. And so the idea of a stepped pyramid was twofold. It's how men could climb up into the heavens to meet the gods and make sacrifice to them, or where the gods could easily come down to where the human beings were, hopefully to recognize they were making sacrifices to them, and for thus feeding the gods and showing honor, and that the gods would bless them. So that's the whole point behind the building of these step pyramids all over the world throughout time. So their first purpose was to penetrate the heavens. And then the other was to make a name for ourselves. You know, man's egotism throughout the years is it centers around a fear we're all going to die, and who's going to remember me? Who's going to remember us? What great thing can we leave behind where people for many, many generations will talk about me or us because of something that they continue to see over multi-generations, like the pyramids that were built, 5,000, the earliest one 5,200 years ago. And so they hope to be remembered in this way, but in a kind of egotistical way. There's nothing wrong about having a name worth remembering, but it needs to be, as God told Abraham, I'll make your name memorable and others remember it. I'll make a great name for you. It's one thing for God to decide to make your name great. It's another thing when you're kind of rebelling against God, following the Nimrod rebellion to say, I'm going to make, or we're going to make a name for ourselves. This is where men get into trouble and where they use their technology in ways to advance themselves and to promote themselves at the expense of God and their relationship with Him. And then finally, they had a fear of being scattered, which is exactly God's command: multiply and fill the earth. But they knew intuitively, if we start scattering, all we'll be able to do is be subsistence farmers and herders of animals. But if we stay together and build these cities and build these great temples that will draw people from all around, maybe we can build a great civilization and we can do all kinds of things. And of course, God acknowledges that that's the case, but not necessarily for good, and that's God's concern. So that's the conversation of human beings. Come, let us do this. Let's make a name for it. Let's not be scattered. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, as I said, that the sons of Adam were building. But the emphasis on this is, you think your tower is so high that you just ride up in the heavens. All God would have to do is take 2 steps and he'd be on the ramp we built. But in this one, God has to come way down to take a look at this tiny tower and tiny city that you have built. Instead of it being this great city and great tower from a human perspective, it was not that big a deal from God's perspective. And many times it says, God comes down and checks out things. And I think it's not suggesting God's incapable of telling what's going on from his normal position, but it's showing that God has enough concern to say, I'm going to come down and visit this and show you that I know what's going on and I have real interest in what's taking place. And then the Lord speaks. Here's the war of words. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, God sees the direction of this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Well, why would that be a problem? Well, what has human history told us? Human beings have come together in cities and formed empires, have made plans to subjugate other people, and have invented all kinds of warfare technology so that they can best other people, to kill them, to enslave them, to steal their gold, their silver, whatever riches they may have, and force them to serve other people. Not in the plan of God from the beginning. We were rulers over the creation, not one another. And so God saw that, it's almost unlimited what they can do. Well, look what's happened just in the last 100 years. We have punctured the heavens with satellites and airplanes and vehicles that went to the moon, and satellites have gone way out exploring our solar system. We have GPS satellites, communication satellites. We can communicate to each other over the internet and other things instantaneously. The very thing that the Tower of Babel people had, we have on steroids. But has our world become this wonderful, peaceful world where everybody loves each other and where we're using all our technology for good? No. We always stand in the shadow of nuclear weapons, one nation wanting to impose its will on another, the threat of a growing power that becomes stronger economically and starts building a massive military. For what purposes? Self-defense? China isn't being threatened by any other nation, but they're building up a huge military at a vast pace. What could possibly be their purposes? I'm sure just to go visit other nations and say hi, show you their missiles and their warfare technology. It used to be the Chinese had very little of a seagoing part. They had a few vessels. Now they've built, just in the last decade, a bunch of carriers, a bunch of ships, hundreds and hundreds of submarines. What's the purpose of all that? Well, you build that to either protect yourself from a threatening power.
Mm-hmm.
Is Russia threatening them? Iran threatening them? America threatening them? No one's threatening them. So therefore, they must hope to become a threat to others. So this is the human drama. You know, we develop all this technology, and so much of it is used to spy on other people, to plan war on other people, to try to win the space race so they can rain down from the heavens destruction on other people. This is what's going on to this very day. Mm-hmm. We live in a Tower of Babel, mm-hmm. where people have a common language they can communicate with, but it hasn't so far, and unfortunately, because of human sin, will not work out in this world as a wonderful thing. There'll be good things that'll come out of it, but there'll be the threat of war, and there will be war, and great destruction will still occur, because, as God said to Noah, your thoughts and inclinations are evil from your youth. This is what makes human beings dangerous, and what makes the will of God for us to be his children, and for us fulfilling his purpose to be thwarted over the years and the centuries. And so that's the story that he's telling here. So God confuses their language, and they're forced to scatter, do the thing that God intended them to do. I think it's also an attempt by God to stop the escalating violence that occurred before the flood, because he's not going to destroy the world again and do a start over in that way. And so what is God going to do if he's not going to destroy the world and start over every time things get bad? Well, that's what he's going to tell us with the rest of the story. But one last point. Remember, we said in chapter 10 that it was all about 70 nations. Remember, to the ancient people, to the Israelites, numbers were important things. The 7 days of creation were about setting up a basis of time that we follow even to this day. It's our week, the fundamental time period that we organize our lives around. And so 10 is also an important number. 10 generations are alluded to in sequence. And so 70, 7 times 10, becomes an important number. And so we see it play out in various ways, 70 being a representative of all the world nation powers. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 5, we have an allusion to the 70 again.
The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt.
So later at the end of the story of Genesis, when the Israelites under Jacob go into Egypt, there are just 70 of them. 70. If you will, a symbolic representation of all nations. And of course, when they come out of Egypt, they're a vast people 400 years later. But the word 70 is also important once this new people is constituted. In chapter 24 of Exodus, there's another reference to this number of 70, verses 9 and following.
Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank.
This is not, I don't think, a commonly known passage, because again, oftentimes says no one can see God. But God allowed Moses, God allowed Nadab and Abihu, God allowed the 70 elders, leaders of Israel to go up. So again, a representative number for the whole people. They went up on the top of Mount Sinai and had a meal in the presence of God and saw God. And it describes this beautiful blue that was a part of his throne. This same vision is picked up in Ezekiel and again in the book of Revelation, as it gives us a picture of the throne of God and of God being on his throne. And here is just a brief allusion to that. But the key is 70 representing the whole. And then we go into the New Testament. We all remember that Jesus, at God's direction, selected 12 to be his core leaders. That was a symbolic number for the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's creating a new Israel. But after he had selected 12 and trained them, the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10 tells us that there was another group that were selected and sent out.
After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go.
If you look in, there's usually a footnote there. There's one in my Bible. And the footnote says R70. So in some manuscripts it says 72, and some it says 70. I would tend to go with the 70 because I think that's a symbolic number where 72 is not. And so 70, what is that saying? I'm sending you out among the lost sheep of house of Israel, you 70 like I did the 12. But again, it's symbolic that eventually I'm going to send you out into the whole world where the quote 70 nations are, so that all people, as I envisioned as part of my people from the beginning, can be a part of my kingdom, the kingdom of light and the kingdom of Christ. So again, a powerful example, I think, of how the number 70 plays out in the biblical narrative. So let's pick up with the last section. Chapter 11 was a continuing genealogy that takes us up to the key figures that are going to be important for the rest of the story of Genesis. So we're picking up in chapter 11, verse 10.
This is the account of Shem's family line. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Reu. And after he became the father of Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Reu had lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. And after he became the father of Serug, Reu lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 330 years, he became the father of Nahor. And after he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah. And after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had sons and daughters. And after Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldean in the land of his birth. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. Bruce, what is the difference between this genealogy and the genealogy in chapter 10?
Yeah, if you remember in chapter 10, it gave a genealogy of Shem. But when it came down to the two sons, one of which was Peleg, it went and took the other son and gave his future genealogy. But now it's returned, giving the same genealogy of Shem, but this time it follows the descendants that come from Peleg, because these are going to be the descendants that end up with the key person, Abram, and his wife Sarah, which is going to concern itself with the ensuing chapters, them and their descendants. Now it's interesting, again, Abram is at the 10th generation, which is again a symbolic number for them, going through a number of generations to finally reach Terah, who has three sons. So it's kind of mirroring Noah, who had three sons, started this all off. And now we come down to Terah, who has three sons. I think the interesting thing in all these genealogies, chapter 10 and 11, it doesn't have that discouraging end to the earlier genealogies. And he lived so many years and he died. And he lived so many years and he died. They kind of lived off and he died in these genealogies. And I think that's because this is a more hopeful genealogy leading to the promise to Abram and therefore a hope for humanity. But again, it keys in on Terah, his family that follows. It lets us know that one of his sons died in Ur of the Chaldees. So evidently the beginning point for the Terah family was Ur of the Chaldeans. And it's from there that they made a journey, headed towards Canaan, went only about halfway there, stopped in Haran, which is kind of northern Syria. It's actually a city in modern Turkey today. And there they camped out. One of the sons died while they're still in Ur of the Chaldees, and then it tells us he had a son named Lot. Well, Lot's going to play into the story that follows. And it tells us that they went as far as Haran and settled there. And so they kind of end the story with that. But also they note that there's this wife of Abram called Sarai, and she had no children because she was incapable of having children. So imagine if you're going to pick someone that you're going to promise that their descendants way down the line are going to create a mighty nation, and that through them you're going to send a messianic figure to bless all the families of the earth, the last person you would pick would be a man with a wife that could have no children. So just like God's Spirit hovered over the infertile earth in Genesis 1 verse 2, and out of it created a habitable land through his rich creative acts, and how the Spirit of God destroyed the world through a flood and yet recreated a new world for Noah and his family to live in, so God now is going to take an infertile woman, wait until she's a grandparent, and then permit her to have a miraculous child, which portends the future, that God is going to promise to do something that seems to be impossible, but with God, nothing is impossible. Now we're on the opposite side of the Tower of Babel approach to nothing's impossible, to a godly side that nothing's impossible when God's seeking to accomplish his purposes. Also, I think it's important to note that the first 11 chapters that introduce the Hebrew Bible tell us explicitly that the God of the Jews is a universal God. He's not just a God of a certain small group of people. He is the creator God. He is the God that cares about all peoples and wants all people to be in a covenant relationship with him. Of course, since they have to choose to do that, they have to be permitted to go their own way until they are willing voluntarily to do so. And so periodically we find, even though God is focused universally on the whole human race, he will select an individual like Abram or an individual people like Israel to keep a true knowledge of him alive so he can continue to work in human history till he gets us to the place that he can send his son through these people that he has selected. And again, with one, he creates a new people, the covenant community of Christ, that now opens up this door to the 70 nations and beyond. And so we always have to keep in mind that even though we get down to one individual, God's not selecting one individual and forgetting the rest. He's selecting this one person in order to work his purposes for the benefit of the whole world. And so consequently, after Jesus' mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, upon his resurrection, he gives his disciples a begin where you are and go into the rest of the world. But you can't do it on your own power. It's back to the spirit power of God that will enable you to fulfill my unique mission to you. And so in Acts 1, verse 8, it says this explicitly.
But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
So it will take the Spirit of God working in men to enable us to fulfill God's original intent, and that is for all of us to be in covenant relationship with him, for us to have an opportunity to really be true image bearers of God. So God never forgets his universal purpose, but he works through individuals and then groups of people to eventually accomplish his purposes. And so the real question for us is, are we allowing him to work in us? Are we seeking a covenant relationship with him? Are we faithful to that covenant? Are we a part of that mission by the power of the Spirit to get the message out to the whole world so that everyone can find that the Creator God is the Redeemer God that has come in Jesus to bring us back to him, so we can all participate in his new covenant community, the church. That's the universal vision of God, starting from the beginning, going to the end.
Bruce, thank you for leading us once again into deeper truths of the story of these genealogy accounts that we've read in the past 2 chapters. And I want to thank you all for joining us and spending your time in this study. And I pray it's been inspirational to you and your growing closer to the Lord. Let us go to God in prayer. Father, we're so grateful to you once again for your word. We thank you for giving us a presence in you through your son, Jesus. And Father, I pray that we continue to seek to grow in you, to seek unity amongst believers. Keep us and guide us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Goodbye, everyone.